Hello, this is a fifth part of the Chunkloading rant, and today I'm going to cover an issue to do with chunks' state of being loaded or unloaded or anything in between being ambiguous. What do I mean by this? Um, when processes in a chunk want to know whether they should be executed or not, they try to figure out if the chunk is loaded or not. But most of them use different criteria to determine that. For example, block ticks and liquid ticks just look at the chunk load level of a chunk and the state of entities, whether they are loaded or not. And if both entities are loaded and the chunk load level is above border, then the block ticks can execute and liquid ticks. But block events do not care about entities. They only require the load level of a chunk to be above border. Entities, well, to be ticked, they have to be loaded, but you can also have entities in a chunk without entities being loaded yet. Yeah, like if you have a chunk that entities didn't finish loading in yet, and you shoot another entity into there, then it will be present there and might be able to tick there, even though other entities didn't finish loading yet. Entities just require the chunk to be loaded to an entity processing level. Block entities only require to be loaded, the chunk load level to be above border, and for example, skulk senses are a bit odd. All of the listeners require the chunk they are in and the adjacent chunks to be block ticking to, well, be able to tick vibrations. Also, raids require certain load level of a chunk to actually start, if I remember correctly, but I didn't look much into that. So, each process requires a different state of a chunk to call the chunk loaded. And it would have worked fine if all of the different criteria that stuff uses were set at the same time at the end of a tick, but that's actually not the case. For example, when entries are loaded into a chunk from memory, that happens in the scheduled task phase. But for example, setting the chunk's load level to some value can happen in scheduled task phase or in chunk management phase or just anywhere if it happens instantly upon a get block call. To better visualize this, here I have game phases visualized. So block ticks, liquid ticks, chunk management, block events, entities, block entities, entity management, and schedule tasks. So when you do a get block call on a not yet loaded chunk, it will get loaded immediately, and its load level will be set to border immediately, instantly, no matter in which phase you performed the get block method. On the other hand, when you load stuff with a portal or unload stuff with a portal, the load level of a chunk that got loaded or unloaded by a portal is set in the chunk management phase. But when you load or unload stuff with a player, the same load level of a chunk gets now set in the scheduled task phase. And when you load chunks with an entipel, the chunk load level gets set in the scheduled task phase. But when the chunks from the same Perl get unloaded, from the expiration of the Perl ticket get unloaded, that now happens in the schedule in the chunk management phase. And this ambiguity in the timing at which chunk load level can change and other criterias for the processes can be start being satisfied or stop being satisfied, creates a ton of desynchronizations between the processes. Almost every process that can happen in a chunk is susceptible to this issue. For example, you can achieve a desynchronization between block ticks and block entity ticks before, well, in the tick, right before the chunk is unloaded with a portal. What do I mean by this? Imagine a chunk is loaded with another portal, And at some point, there starts a game tick at which the ticket of the nether portal expires. What will happen? First, the block ticks and liquid ticks get processed as usual. Then in the chunk management phase, the ticket expires, sets the chunk load level to a border or even less, and all of the other stuff after that gets skipped because all of these processes require the chunk to be loaded above border level, and now it's not. But so everything past the chunk management phase gets skipped. But when you load the chunk back in as a player, it starts again at the start of the tick, and everything happens consecutively as usual. Thus, the block events, entries, and block entry ticks just skip the game tick, and now the timings in your contraption are desynchronized. Let me show the exact showcase setup for particular example of block ticks and block entry ticks. Here I have an AND gateway, which has a block entry, which ticks each game tick and increments its age value. And to the right, I have a scoreboard which shows the amount of times the block ticks were ticked in this particular chunk. This scoreboard is incremented via this repeating command block, which is performing its command within each block tick phase while it's loaded. Let me freeze the game to show you the age of the gateway. Here, as you can see, the age of the gateway matches the amount of times block ticks were ticked in this chunk. And if I step one tick forward and get the age again, it again matches the amount of times block ticks were ticked in this chunk, and that is expected. But watch what happens if this chunk gets unloaded via this portal. First, let me unfreeze the game, and then here I spawned a snowball on the nether side, which went through a portal and loaded this chunk with a portal ticket. Then it switched me to spectator, and because the game rule spectator generates chunks is set to false, I am no longer loading this chunk. It's only the portal that loads it. Here, this green chunk is loaded to an entity processing level. Thus, this blue chunk is border loaded. And now, as you can see on the timer of the block ticks, the portal ticket already expired and unloaded this chunk. Well, set its load level to border. And now, if you take a look at the amount of times block ticks were processed in this chunk, 1,069 times. And if you take a look at the age of the gateway, 1,068 ticks. This means that block entries within this chunk were ticked one time less than the block ticks. This happened for the reason with the game phases I explained before. And if I go back into creative and freeze the game, you can see that the desynchronization between the amount of times block entries got ticked and block ticks got ticked is persistent. It's now still there. Moreover, if I trigger this contraption again, tick and freeze, then after the portal ticket expires, you will be able to see that the desynchronization between block entity ticks and block ticks stacks. Now, instead of one tick, it will be 2 game ticks. And let me show it to you. I'll go back into creative, freeze the game, and now the age value is different from the amount of times block ticks were ticked, not by 1, but by 2. And this mismatch will only grow each time I reload the chunk. Again, it is very important to understand that this issue is not only affects specifically block entity ticks and block ticks, it affects all of the different processes. And also, it does not only happen when specifically the load level of a chunk changes, because there are other characteristics of a chunk that may determine when some of the processes will consider the chunk to be loaded or not. For example, as I showed in the first video in the series, block ticks also require entries to be loaded. And as it happens in a completely different time in the game tick and like in an arbitrary game tick, not even in a fixed one, this timing can break not only due to uh, chunk's load level being set, but from any part of the chunk starting or finishing loading or unloading. There is a rather simple way to fix it. Uh, the chunks just need to have a unified way to tell whether the chunk is finished loading from memory and assigning the load level or not. And all of the processes have to use this unified identifier of chunks load state instead of whatever they are using now. And also that unified load state indicator also have to be set has to be set at the very end of the game tick to disallow the phase mismatches as with the chunk management phase shown in the example. This unified way to determine whether a chunk is loaded or not must require, well, must only say that the chunk is loaded when every part of the chunk finished loading, unlike it is now. Like, the chunk can be called loaded for these processes only when entries finished loading, block ticks finished loading, everything else finished loading into memory. Also, everything became accessible and registered. All of the tickers are registered when the ticket of the chunk that loaded the chunk, if it was loaded by a ticket, if a set ticket finished processing, if the chunk's load level is aligns with the one it's supposed to have from the ticket that loaded it. And only then, if all of these criteria are satisfied simultaneously, can the processes call the chunk loaded and be processed in it. Uh, and if at least one of these criteria is not satisfied, like for example, when we started unloading a chunk and the first thing that happened is chunk got marked to be inaccessible or something, then all of the processes will immediately start treating the chunk as unloaded and will stop being processed in it simultaneously. That's important because, well, otherwise there will be a lot of desynchronizations. Um, so yeah, I think that's it for today. I really hope that the problem is clear to you. If you have questions, please ask them in the comments. I will answer them because I want to make sure that people understood this particular nuance of chunk loading because it's one of the most important ones. Uh, yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.